Chapter 15. At the end of January, Pierre went to Moscow and stayed in an annex of his house which had not been burned. He called on Count Rostophin and on some acquaintances who were back in Moscow, and he intended to leave for Petersburg 2 days later. Everybody was celebrating the victory, everything was bubbling with life in the ruined but reviving city. Everyone was pleased to see Pierre, everyone wished to meet him, and everyone questioned him about what he had seen. Pierre felt particularly well disposed toward them all, but was now instinctively on his guard for fear of binding himself in any way. To all questions put to him, whether important or quite trifling, such as, where would he live? Was he going to rebuild? When was he going to Petersburg, and would he mind taking a parcel for someone? He replied, yes, perhaps, or, I think so, and so on. He had heard that the Rostovs were at Kostroma, but the thought of Natasha seldom occurred to him. If it did, it was only as a pleasant memory of the distant past. He felt himself not only free from social obligations but also from that feeling which, it seemed to him, he had aroused in himself. On the 3rd day after his arrival he heard from the Drobetskoys that Princess Mary was in Moscow. The death, sufferings, and last days of Prince Andrew had often occupied Pierre's thoughts and now recurred to him with fresh vividness. Having heard at dinner that Princess Mary was in Moscow and living in her house, which had not been burned, in Vozdvizhenka Street, he drove that same evening to see her. On his way to the house Pierre kept thinking of Prince Andrew, of their friendship, of his various meetings with him, and especially of the last one at Borodino. Is it possible that he died in the bitter frame of mind he was then in? Is it possible that the meaning of life was not disclosed to him before he died, thought Pierre. He recalled Karateev and his death and involuntarily began to compare these two men, so different, and yet so similar in that they had both lived and both died, and in the love he felt for both of them. Pierre drove up to the house of the old prince in a most serious mood. The house had escaped the fire. It showed signs of damage, but its general aspect was unchanged. The old footman, who met Pierre with a stern face as if wishing to make the visitor feel that the absence of the old prince had not disturbed the order of things in the house, informed him that the princess had gone to her own apartments, and that she received on Sundays. "Announce me. Perhaps she will see me," said Pierre. "Yes, sir," said the man. "Please step into the portrait gallery." A few minutes later the footman returned with Dessalles, who brought word from the princess that she would be very glad to see Pierre if he would excuse her want of ceremony and come upstairs to her apartment. In a rather low room lit by one candle sat the princess, and with her another person dressed in black. Pierre remembered that the princess always had lady companions, but who they were and what they were like he never knew or remembered. This must be one of her companions, he thought, glancing at the lady in the black dress. The princess rose quickly to meet him and held out her hand. "Yes," she said, looking at his altered face after he had kissed her hand, "so this is how we meet again. He spoke of you even at the very last," she went on, turning her eyes from Pierre to her companion with a shyness that surprised him for an instant. "I was so glad to hear of your safety. It was the first piece of good news we had received for a long time." Again the princess glanced round at her companion with even more uneasiness in her manner and was about to add something, but Pierre interrupted her. "Just imagine, I knew nothing about him," said he. "I thought he had been killed. All I know I heard at second hand from others. I only know that he fell in with the Rostovs. What a strange coincidence." Pierre spoke rapidly and with animation. He glanced once at the companion's face, saw her attentive and kindly gaze fixed on him, and, as often happens when one is talking, felt somehow that this companion in the black dress was a good, kind, excellent creature who would not hinder his conversing freely with Princess Mary. But when he mentioned the Rostovs, Princess Mary's face expressed still greater embarrassment. She again glanced rapidly from Pierre's face to that of the lady in the black dress and said, "Do you really not recognize her?" Pierre looked again at the companion's pale, delicate face with its black eyes and peculiar mouth, and something near to him, long forgotten and more than sweet, looked at him from those attentive eyes. "But no, it can't be," he thought. "This stern, thin, pale face that looks so much older. It cannot be she. It merely reminds me of her. But at that moment Princess Mary said, Natasha. And with difficulty, effort, and stress, like the opening of a door grown rusty on its hinges, a smile appeared on the face with the attentive eyes, and from that opening door came a breath of fragrance which suffused Pierre with a happiness he had long forgotten and of which he had not even been thinking, especially at that moment. It suffused him, seized him, and enveloped him completely. When she smiled, doubt was no longer possible, it was Natasha and he loved her. At that moment Pierre involuntarily betrayed to her, to Princess Mary, and above all to himself, a secret of which he himself had been unaware. He flushed joyfully yet with painful distress. He tried to hide his agitation. But the more he tried to hide it, the more clearly, clearer than any words could have done, did he betray to himself, to her, and to Princess Mary that he loved her. No, it's only the unexpectedness of it, thought Pierre. But as soon as he tried to continue the conversation he had begun with Princess Mary, he again glanced at Natasha, and a still deeper flush suffused his face and a still stronger agitation of mingled joy and fear seized his soul. He became confused in his speech and stopped in the middle of what he was saying. Pierre had failed to notice Natasha because he did not at all expect to see her there, but he had failed to recognize her because the change in her since he last saw her was immense. She had grown thin and pale, but that was not what made her unrecognizable. She was unrecognizable at the moment he entered because on that face whose eyes had always shone with a suppressed smile of the joy of life, now when he first entered and glanced at her there was not the least shadow of a smile, only her eyes were kindly attentive and sadly interrogative. Pierre's confusion was not reflected by any confusion on Natasha's part, but only by the pleasure that just perceptibly lit up her whole face. Chapter 16. She has come to stay with me, said Princess Mary. The Count and Countess will be here in a few days. The Countess is in a dreadful state, but it was necessary for Natasha herself to see a doctor. They insisted on her coming with me. Yes, is there a family free from sorrow now? Said Pierre, addressing Natasha. You know it happened the very day we were rescued. I saw him. What a delightful boy he was. Natasha looked at him, and by way of answer to his words her eyes widened and lit up. What can one say or think of as a consolation, said Pierre. Nothing. Why had such a splendid boy, so full of life, to die? Yes, in these days it would be hard to live without faith, remarked Princess Mary. Yes, yes, that is really true, Pierre hastily interrupted her. Why is it true? Natasha asked, looking attentively into Pierre's eyes. How can you ask why, said Princess Mary. The thought alone of what awaits. Natasha without waiting for Princess Mary to finish again looked inquiringly at Pierre. And because, Pierre continued, only one who believes that there is a God ruling us can bear a loss such as hers and yours. Natasha had already opened her mouth to speak but suddenly stopped. Pierre hurriedly turned away from her and again addressed Princess Mary, asking about his friend's last days. Pierre's confusion had now almost vanished, but at the same time he felt that his freedom had also completely gone. He felt that there was now a judge of his every word and action whose judgment mattered more to him than that of all the rest of the world. As he spoke now he was considering what impression his words would make on Natasha. He did not purposely say things to please her, but whatever he was saying he regarded from her standpoint. Princess Mary, reluctantly as is usual in such cases, began telling of the condition in which she had found Prince Andrew. But Pierre's face quivering with emotion, his questions and his eager restless expression, gradually compelled her to go into details which she feared to recall for her own sake. Yes, yes, and so. Pierre kept saying as he leaned toward her with his whole body and eagerly listened to her story. Yes, yes, so he grew tranquil and softened. With all his soul he had always sought one thing, to be perfectly good, so he could not be afraid of death. The faults he had, if he had any, were not of his making. So he did soften. What a happy thing that he saw you again, he added, suddenly turning to Natasha and looking at her with eyes full of tears. Natasha's face twitched. She frowned and lowered her eyes for a moment. She hesitated for an instant whether to speak or not. Yes, that was happiness, she then said in her quiet voice with its deep chest notes. For me it certainly was happiness. She paused. And he said he was wishing for it at the very moment I entered the room. Natasha's voice broke. She blushed, pressed her clasped hands on her knees, and then controlling herself with an evident effort lifted her head and began to speak rapidly. We knew nothing of it when we started from Moscow. I did not dare to ask about him. Then suddenly Sonia told me he was traveling with us. I had no idea and could not imagine what state he was in, all I wanted was to see him and be with him, she said, trembling, and breathing quickly. And not letting them interrupt her she went on to tell what she had never yet mentioned to anyone, all she had lived through during those 3 weeks of their journey and life at Yaroslavl. Pierre listened to her with lips parted and eyes fixed upon her full of tears. As he listened he did not think of Prince Andrew, nor of death, nor of what she was telling. He listened to her and felt only pity for her, for what she was suffering now while she was speaking. Princess Mary, frowning in her effort to hold back her tears, sat beside Natasha, and heard for the first time the story of those last days of her brothers and Natasha's love. Evidently Natasha needed to tell that painful yet joyful tale. She spoke, mingling most trifling details with the intimate secrets of her soul, and it seemed as if she could never finish. Several times she repeated the same thing twice. Desaulles' voice was heard outside the door asking whether little Nicholas might come in to say good night. Well, that's all, everything, said Natasha. She got up quickly just as Nicholas entered, almost ran to the door which was hidden by curtains, struck her head against it, and rushed from the room with a moan either of pain or sorrow. Pierre gazed at the door through which she had disappeared and did not understand why he suddenly felt all alone in the world. Princess Mary roused him from his abstraction by drawing his attention to her nephew who had entered the room. At that moment of emotional tenderness young Nicholas' face, which resembled his father's, affected Pierre so much that when he had kissed the boy he got up quickly, took out his handkerchief, and went to the window. He wished to take leave of Princess Mary, but she would not let him go. No, Natasha and I sometimes don't go to sleep till after 2, so please don't go. I will order supper. Go downstairs, we will come immediately. Before Pierre left the room Princess Mary told him, this is the first time she has talked of him like that. Chapter 17. Pierre was shown into the large, brightly lit dining room. A few minutes later he heard footsteps and Princess Mary entered with Natasha. Natasha was calm, though a severe and grave expression had again settled on her face. They all three of them now experienced that feeling of awkwardness which usually follows after a serious and heartfelt talk. It is impossible to go back to the same conversation, to talk of trifles is awkward, and yet the desire to speak is there and silence seems like affectation. They went silently to table. The footmen drew back the chairs and pushed them up again. Pierre unfolded his cold table napkin and, resolving to break the silence, looked at Natasha and at Princess Mary. They had evidently both formed the same resolution, the eyes of both shone with satisfaction and a confession that besides sorrow life also has joy. Do you take vodka, Count? Asked Princess Mary, and those words suddenly banished the shadows of the past. Now tell us about yourself, said she. One hears such improbable wonders about you. Yes, replied Pierre with the smile of mild irony now habitual to him. They even tell me wonders I myself never dreamed of. Mary Abramovna invited me to her house and kept telling me what had happened, or ought to have happened, to me. Stepan Stepanych also instructed me how I ought to tell of my experiences. In general I have noticed that it is very easy to be an interesting man. I am an interesting man now, people invite me out and tell me all about myself. Natasha smiled and was on the point of speaking. We have been told, Princess Mary interrupted her, that you lost 2 millions in Moscow. Is that true? But I am 3 times as rich as before, returned Pierre. Though the position was now altered by his decision to pay his wife's debts and to rebuild his houses, Pierre still maintained that he had become 3 times as rich as before. What I have certainly gained is freedom, he began seriously, but did not continue, noticing that this theme was too egotistic. And are you building? Yes. Savlik says I must. Tell me, you did not know of the Countess' death when you decided to remain in Moscow, asked Princess Mary and immediately blushed, noticing that her question, following his mention of freedom, ascribed to his words a meaning he had perhaps not intended. No, answered Pierre, evidently not considering awkward the meaning Princess Mary had given to his words. I heard of it in oral and you cannot imagine how it shocked me. We were not an exemplary couple, he added quickly, glancing at Natasha and noticing on her face curiosity as to how he would speak of his wife, but her death shocked me terribly. When two people quarrel they are always both in fault, and one's own guilt suddenly becomes terribly serious when the other is no longer alive. And then such a death, without friends and without consolation. I am very, very sorry for her, he concluded, and was pleased to notice a look of glad approval on Natasha's face. Yes, and so you are once more an eligible bachelor, said Princess Mary. Pierre suddenly flushed crimson and for a long time tried not to look at Natasha. When he ventured to glance her way again her face was cold, stern, and he fancied even contemptuous. And did you really see and speak to Napoleon, as we have been told, said Princess Mary. Pierre laughed. No, not once. Everybody seems to imagine that being taken prisoner means being Napoleon's guest. Not only did I never see him but I heard nothing about him, I was in much lower company. Supper was over, and Pierre who at first declined to speak about his captivity was gradually led on to do so. But it's true that you remained in Moscow to kill Napoleon? Natasha asked with a slight smile. I guessed it then when we met at the Sukharov Tower, do you remember? Pierre admitted that it was true, and from that was gradually led by Princess Mary's questions and especially by Natasha's into giving a detailed account of his adventures. At first he spoke with the amused and mild irony now customary with him toward everybody and especially toward himself, but when he came to describe the horrors and sufferings he had witnessed he was unconsciously carried away and began speaking with the suppressed emotion of a man re-experiencing in recollection strong impressions he has lived through. Princess Mary with a gentle smile looked now at Pierre and now at Natasha. In the whole narrative she saw only Pierre and his goodness. Natasha, leaning on her elbow, the expression of her face constantly changing with the narrative, watched Pierre with an attention that never wandered, evidently herself experiencing all that he described. Not only her look, but her exclamations and the brief questions she put, showed Pierre that she understood just what he wished to convey. It was clear that she understood not only what he said but also what he wished to, but could not, express in words. The account Pierre gave of the incident with the child and the woman for protecting whom he was arrested was this: it was an awful sight, children abandoned, some in the flames. One was snatched out before my eyes, and there were women who had their things snatched off and their earrings torn out. He flushed and grew confused. Then a patrol arrived and all the men, all those who were not looting, that is, were arrested, and I among them. I am sure you're not telling us everything, I am sure you did something, said Natasha and pausing added, something fine. Pierre continued. When he spoke of the execution he wanted to pass over the horrible details, but Natasha insisted that he should not omit anything. Pierre began to tell about Karateev, but paused. By this time he had risen from the table and was pacing the room, Natasha following him with her eyes. Then he added. No, you can't understand what I learned from that illiterate man, that simple fellow. Yes, yes, go on, said Natasha. Where is he? They killed him almost before my eyes. And Pierre, his voice trembling continually, went on to tell of the last days of their retreat, of Karateev's illness and his death. He told of his adventures as he had never yet recalled them. He now, as it were, saw a new meaning in all he had gone through. Now that he was telling it all to Natasha he experienced that pleasure which a man has when women listen to him, not clever women who when listening either try to remember what they hear to enrich their minds and when opportunity offers to retell it, or who wish to adopt it to some thought of their own and promptly contribute their own clever comments prepared in their little mental workshop, but the pleasure given by real women gifted with a capacity to select and absorb the very best a man shows of himself. Natasha, without knowing it, was all attention. She did not lose a word, no single quiver in Pierre's voice, no look, no twitch of a muscle in his face, nor a single gesture. She caught the unfinished word in its flight and took it straight into her open heart, divining the secret meaning of all Pierre's mental travail. Princess Mary understood his story and sympathized with him, but she now saw something else that absorbed all her attention. She saw the possibility of love and happiness between Natasha and Pierre, and the first thought of this filled her heart with gladness. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The footmen came in with sad and stern faces to change the candles, but no one noticed them. Pierre finished his story. Natasha continued to look at him intently with bright, attentive, and animated eyes, as if trying to understand something more which he had perhaps left untold. Pierre, in shamefaced and happy confusion, glanced occasionally at her, and tried to think what to say next to introduce a fresh subject. Princess Mary was silent. It occurred to none of them that it was 3 o'clock and time to go to bed. People speak of misfortunes and sufferings, remarked Pierre, but if at this moment I were asked, would you rather be what you were before you were taken prisoner, or go through all this again, then for heaven's sake let me again have captivity and horseflesh. We imagine that when we are thrown out of our usual ruts all is lost, but it is only then that what is new and good begins. While there is life there is happiness. There is much, much before us. I say this to you, he added, turning to Natasha. Yes, yes, she said, answering something quite different. I too should wish nothing but to relive it all from the beginning. Pierre looked intently at her. Yes, and nothing more, said Natasha. It's not true, cried Pierre. I am not to blame for being alive and wishing to live, nor you either. Suddenly Natasha bent her head, covered her face with her hands, and began to cry. What is it, Natasha? Said Princess Mary. Nothing, nothing. She smiled at Pierre through her tears. Good night. It is time for bed. Pierre rose and took his leave. Princess Mary and Natasha met as usual in the bedroom. They talked of what Pierre had told them. Princess Mary did not express her opinion of Pierre, nor did Natasha speak of him. Well, good night, Mary, said Natasha. Do you know, I am often afraid that by not speaking of him, she meant Prince Andrew, for fear of not doing justice to our feelings, we forget him. Princess Mary sighed deeply and thereby acknowledged the justice of Natasha's remark, but she did not express agreement in words. Is it possible to forget? Said she. It did me so much good to tell all about it today. It was hard and painful, but good, very good, said Natasha. I am sure he really loved him. That is why I told him. Was it all right? She added, suddenly blushing. To tell Pierre. Oh, yes. What a splendid man he is, said Princess Mary. Do you know, Mary, Natasha suddenly said with a mischievous smile such as Princess Mary had not seen on her face for a long time, he has somehow grown so clean, smooth, and fresh, as if he had just come out of a Russian bath, do you understand? Out of a moral bath. Isn't it true? Yes, replied Princess Mary. He has greatly improved. With a short coat and his hair cropped, just as if he had come straight from the bath. Papa used to. I understand why he, Prince Andrew, liked no one so much as him, said Princess Mary. Yes, and yet he is quite different. They say men are friends when they are quite different. That must be true. Really he is quite unlike him, in everything. Yes, but he's wonderful. Well, good night, said Natasha. And the same mischievous smile lingered for a long time on her face as if it had been forgotten there.